Drive to Survive has received massive backlash in the past couple of days, primarily because of the twisting reality narrative, as well as missing out on key talking points from the 2024 season. Max Verstappen has already expressed his negative attitude towards the show, but now he's refueled the talks yet again after commenting on the picture of him at the Miami GP. With all this in mind, is Drive to Survive really hurting Formula One's image? And if so, what can they do to make it more appealing to the new fans? There is no question about it, Drive to Survive is a very controversial show because of how they're putting certain scenarios on the screen compared to what actually happened on the track. The situation has evolved massively, starting from Norris' win in Miami, a day that, if you remember, was one in which Verstappen was very much present in the celebrations with the Brit. There were even pictures of these two partying in Miami after the race, and Verstappen was the one commenting that he was very happy that his friend and rival won a race in his career. But if you're to watch the episode that talks about the first win of Norris, then you would find a very different narrative for Verstappen, a much more devilish one compared to the real version of Max. The show has gone on to put inserts from Max's reactions from the Dutch GP and had Jenson Button talking in the background about how he is not going to accept the rivalry easily, when in fact it was nothing but a stir from the directors of the show. This is something that Verstappen has talked about, and when addressing the situation, he said, "Apparently, I was very sad after Miami. I literally had the best time ever on Sunday." This is, as I mentioned earlier in the video, not the first time that Verstappen has called out the show for creating narratives that don't exist in real life. If we're to look at his statement back from 2023, it makes a lot of sense as to why he doesn't love the show, but now he's addressed the fondness that he has towards Drive to Survive on a much more subtle basis. When being asked as to whether or not he's the biggest hater of the show, Verstappen decided to keep quiet and rather not talk about it, which goes to show that he still has the same view as he did back in 2023. There is no doubt that the show needs to do something extra compared to what actually happened on the grid, because at the end of the day, it is a TV show. It needs to have dramatic moments and it needs to be highly anticipated so that new fans will find it more appealing to watch. However, twisting the reality that much is probably a limit that shouldn't be crossed, and it's creating a lot of negatives among the fans now. There are tons of comments from people who went on to say that the situation of Max being portrayed the way he was in that episode is precisely why they don't watch the show or why they don't take it very seriously. On the other hand, this is just the beginning, and there are tons of other stories that have been twisted by the directors. We're just getting started. If you watch the episode where Russell has been given the leadership role in Mercedes as the team signed Antonelli, you will find one detail very bizarre. The disqualification is not talked about at all. Russell did win the race with a one-stop strategy and did have an amazing defensive skill set against his teammate Hamilton. However, his car was illegal as it weighed a lot less than it should, which is why he got disqualified at the end of the race. In Russell's eyes, he's still the winner of the race, and Wolff did say that disqualification didn't change his mind about the process of promoting Russell to the role he's going to have from 2025 onwards. But nevertheless, the reality is that he's not the winner of the Belgian GP, it's Hamilton, and that fact being left out of the show goes to precisely tell how important it is that the directors pay attention to these facts. However, there are a lot more stories that haven't even been touched on in the latest season of Drive to Survive, and whether we like it or not, they're going to have a negative impact on the show's credibility, as if that wasn't the case up until now. If you haven't watched a single race throughout the history of Formula One and want to know more about the sport, then based on Drive to Survive, you would believe that the Belgian GP ended with a 1-2 finish of Mercedes. That's a massive problem that needs to be fixed sooner rather than later, because it's definitely hurting the picture of Formula One to a much greater extent. You can't have directors twisting and bending reality just for likes and popularity. You can add a dramatic effect or maybe emphasize something a bit more than what's actually there, but as long as it's in the borders of the truth. For a comparison, we all knew that the Norris-Ricciardo rivalry in McLaren was blown out of proportion, but it was still somehow a supported argument because Norris didn't care about his teammate at all, which he shouldn't do in the first place, and Netflix found a sweet spot to develop just around that fact. There are other stories that haven't been talked about nearly enough, such as the first win of Hamilton in Mercedes in Silverstone after 2021. It was one of the most emotional races for the 7-time world champion, and while it was covered in the episode where Netflix left out the disqualification of Russell, it wasn't properly processed for the fans to understand how important this win was for the home hero. Nevertheless, we can at least say that it was talked about to a certain extent, but what about the stories that have changed the landscape of the sport in the future and haven't been mentioned even once? As you are probably familiar with, the biggest story of the 2024 season, apart from Hamilton's move to Ferrari, was the Newey departure from Red Bull and him joining forces with Aston Martin. This is a move that has perpetually started talks about Verstappen joining the team from 2026 onwards when the new regulations kick in, but for Drive to Survive it wasn't worth covering at all. There was a good amount of coverage for Horner's internal struggles with Red Bull, but what the show failed to capture for the fans is this being the reason why people like Newey, Wheatley and Courtenay left in the first place. It also failed to pay the respect that Adrian deserves. He is, of course, one of the greatest masterminds in the sport, and to see him not being covered enough and the real fans not having more insight as to why he decided to change his environment after 20 years is definitely quite disappointing. Apart from that, Newey is now a very influential figure in Aston Martin, and with him having a great say into the team's operations, you would probably want to know more about the nature of his contract and why he accepted these terms in the first place. These are the things that real F1 fans want to watch, and for example, we didn't really have enough coverage of Behrman's debut in Saudi Arabia either. This was the race where a young driver proved to the entire Formula One world that he is the future of the sport, and this is the race that brought him to the seat in Haas. Furthermore, Behrman is the only rookie to score points with 2 different teams in a season in the history of the sport, as he also went on to score points with Haas in Baku. But this was definitely not the most interesting part in the heads of the directors of Drive to Survive. There is no doubt that people are now starting to get very angry with the direction that Drive to Survive is slowly but surely moving towards, and whether we like it or not, there needs to be a lot of discussion on this matter. Fans are expressing their anger on X as well as other social media platforms, and while you can just sit idle and not watch the show at all, it wouldn't create too big of a fuss because there are of course still people feeding themselves purely on this show's information. Nobody is disputing the influence that Drive to Survive had on the growth of the sport because it offered this unique opportunity to have a bit of a sneak peek into the drivers' personal lives, but to twist the truth that much just to receive a bit of a dramatic effect is not the basis that you want to have moving forward. With all this in mind, what do you think about the 7th season of Drive to Survive? And more importantly, do you think these blunders should be talked about to a greater extent? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want to know more about Cadillac's potential lineups from 2026 onwards, make sure to check out the video that's appearing on your screen right now.